Welcome back to Emily A to Z. My name is Emily, and today is a WIP Wednesday video. We are going to be continuing on in our story, The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Pfaall, written by Edgar Allan Poe. This story is in the public domain, which is why I can read it here to you with no problem. I'm also continuing to work on my Peacock Biscornu piece. This is designed by Faby Reilly on 28 count casual linen in ice blue, using all of the called for colors. We have about 10 pages left in our story today, which is rather exciting. I don't know if we'll finish it, but we'll find out. We'll see where it gets us. When we last left off, our narrative had started transforming into daily journal entries instead of an hour-by-hour account. And we're about to pick up on April 15th, which ironically is right around the time that I am recording all of this. So that's fun. Let us begin. April 15th. Not even the outlines of continents and seas could now be traced upon the earth with distinctness. About 12 o'clock I became aware, for the third time, of that appalling sound which had so astonished me before. It now, however, continued for some moments, and gathered intensity as it continued. At length, while stupefied and terror-stricken, I stood in expectation of I knew not what hideous destruction. The car vibrated with excessive violence, and a gigantic and flaming mass of some material which I could not distinguish came with a voice of 1,000 thunders, roaring and booming by the balloon. When my fears and astonishment had in some degree subsided, I had little difficulty in supposing it to be some mighty volcanic fragment ejected from that world to which I was so rapidly approaching, and in all probability one of that singular class of substances occasionally picked up on the earth, and termed meteoric stones for want of a better appellation. April 16th. Today, looking upward as well as I could, through each of the small windows alternately, I beheld, to my great delight, a very small portion of the moon's disk protruding, as it were, on all sides beyond the huge circumference of the balloon. My agitation was extreme, for I had now little doubt of soon reaching the end of my perilous voyage. Indeed, the labor now required by the condenser had increased to a most oppressive degree, and allowed me scarcely any respite from exertion. Sleep was a matter nearly out of the question. I became quite ill, and my frame trembled with exhaustion. It was impossible that human nature could endure this state of intense suffering much longer. During the now brief interval of darkness, a meteoric stone again passed in my vicinity, and the frequency of these phenomena began to occasion me much apprehension. April 17th. This morning proved an epoch in my voyage. It will be remembered that on the 13th the earth subtended an angular breadth of 25 degrees. On the 14th this had greatly diminished. On the 15th a still more remarkable decrease was observable, and on retiring on the night of the 16th I had noticed an angle of no more than about 7 degrees and 15 minutes. What, therefore, must have been my amazement on awakening from a brief and disturbed slumber on the morning of this day, the 17th, at finding the surface beneath me so suddenly and wonderfully augmented in volume as to subtend no less than 39 degrees in apparent angular diameter. I was thunderstruck, and I have no idea what he's talking about. No words can give any adequate idea of the extreme, the absolute horror and astonishment with which I was seized, possessed, and altogether overwhelmed. My knees tottered beneath me, my teeth chattered, my hair started up on end. The balloon, then, had actually burst. These were the first tumultuous ideas that hurried through my mind. The balloon had positively burst. I was falling with the most impetuous, the most unparalleled velocity. To judge by the immense distance already so quickly passed over, it could not be more than 10 minutes at the farthest before I should reach the surface of the earth and be hurled into annihilation. But at length reflection came to my relief. I paused, I considered, and I began to doubt. The matter was impossible. I could not, in any reason, have so rapidly come down. Besides, although I was evidently approaching the surface below me, it was with a speed by no means commensurate with the velocity I had at first conceived. This consideration served to calm the perturbation of my mind, and I finally succeeded in regarding the phenomenon in its proper point of view. In fact, amazement must have fairly deprived me of my senses, when I could not see the vast difference in appearance between the surface below me and the surface of my Mother Earth. The latter was indeed over my head and completely hidden by the balloon, while the moon itself in all its glory, lay beneath me and at my feet. Okay. Drink break. Just enjoying a nice cold water today. The stupor and surprise produced in my mind by this extraordinary change in the posture of affairs was perhaps, after all, that part of the adventure least susceptible of explanation. For the bouleversement in itself was not only natural and inevitable, but had been long actually anticipated as a circumstance to be expected whenever I should arrive at that exact point of my voyage where the attraction of the planet should be superseded by the attraction of the satellite, or, more precisely, where the gravitation of the balloon toward the earth should be less powerful than its gravitation toward the moon. To be sure, I arose from a sound slumber, with all my senses in confusion, to the contemplation of a very startling phenomenon, and one which, although expected, was not expected at the moment. The revolution itself must, of course, have taken place in an easy and gradual manner, and it is by no means clear that, had I even been awake at the time of the occurrence, I should have made aware of it by any internal evidence of an inversion. That is to say, by any inconvenience or disarrangement either about my person or about my apparatus. It is almost needless to say that upon coming to a due sense of my situation, and emerging from the terror which had absorbed every faculty of my soul, my attention was, in the first place, wholly directed to the contemplation of the general physical appearance of the moon. It lay beneath me like a chart, and although I judged it to be still at no inconsiderable distance, the indentures of its surface were defined to my vision with a most striking and altogether unaccountable distinctness. The entire absence of ocean or sea, and indeed of any lake or river or body of water whatsoever, struck me, at first glance, as the most extraordinary feature in its geological condition. Yet, strange to say, I beheld vast level regions of a character decidedly alluvial, although by far the greater portion of the hemisphere in sight was covered by innumerable volcanic mountains, conical in shape, and having more the appearance of artificial than of natural protuberances. The highest among them does not exceed 3 3/4 miles in perpendicular elevation, but a map of the volcanic districts of the Campi Flegrei would afford to your excellencies a better idea of their general surface than any unworthy description I might think proper to attempt. The greater part of them were in a state of evident eruption, and gave me fearfully to understand their fury and their power by the repeated thunders of the miscalled meteoric stones, which now rushed upward by the balloon with a frequency more and more appalling. Oh, big sigh from Kennedy. April 18th. Today I found an enormous increase in the moon's apparent bulk, and the evidently accelerated velocity of my descent began to fill me with alarm. He gonna land on the moon? It will be remembered that in the earliest stage of my speculations upon the possibility of a passage to the moon, The existence in its vicinity of an atmosphere, dense in proportion to the bulk of the planet, had entered largely into my calculations. This, too, in spite of many theories to the contrary, and, it may be added, in spite of a general disbelief in the existence of any lunar atmosphere at all. Drink break. But in addition to what I have already urged in regard to Inck's comet and the zodiacal light, I have been strengthened in my opinion by certain observations of Mr. Schroeder of Lilienthal. He observed the moon when 2 days and a half old, in the evening soon after sunset, before the dark part was visible, and continued to watch it until it became visible. The two cusps appeared tapering in a very sharp faint prolongation, each exhibiting its farthest extremity faintly illuminated by the solar rays, before any part of the dark hemisphere was visible. Soon afterward, the whole dark limb became illuminated. The prolongation of the cusps beyond the semicircle, I thought, must have arisen from the refraction of the sun's rays by the moon's atmosphere. I computed also the height of the atmosphere, which could refract light enough into its dark hemisphere to produce a twilight more luminous than the light reflected from the earth when the moon is about 32 degrees from the new, to be 1,356 Paris feet. In this view, I supposed the greatest height capable of refracting the solar ray to be 5,376 feet. My ideas on this topic had also received confirmation by a passage in the 82nd volume of the Philosophical Transactions, in which it is stated that, at an occultation of Jupiter's satellites, the third disappeared after having been about 1 minute or 2 minutes of time indistinct, and the fourth became indiscernible near the limb. And there's a footnote. Hevelius writes that he has several times found in skies perfectly clear, when even stars of the 6th and 7th magnitude were conspicuous, that at the same altitude of the moon, at the same elongation from the earth, and with one and the same excellent telescope, the moon and its maculae did not appear equally lucid at all times. From the circumstances of the observation, it is evident that the cause of this phenomenon is not either in our air, in the tube, in the moon, or in the eye of the spectator, but must be looked for in something, an atmosphere, existing about the moon. Cassini frequently observed Saturn, Jupiter, and the fixed stars, when approaching the moon to occultation, to have their circular figure changed into an oval one, and in other occultations he found no alteration of figure at all. Hence it might be supposed that at some times, and not at others, there is a dense matter encompassing the moon wherein the rays of the stars are refracted. And that's the end of that footnote. Upon the resistance, or more properly, upon the support of an atmosphere existing in the state of density imagined, I had, of course, entirely depended for the safety of my ultimate descent. Should I then, after all, prove to have been mistaken, I had in consequence nothing better to expect as a finale to my adventure than being dashed into atoms against the rugged surface of the satellite. And indeed, I had now every reason to be terrified. My distance from the moon was comparatively trifling, while the labor required by the condenser was diminished not at all, and I could discover no indication whatever of a decreasing rarity in the air. Oh no, he's gonna crash into the moon! April 19th. This morning, to my great joy, about 9 o'clock, the surface of the moon being frightfully near and my apprehensions excited to the utmost, the pump of my condenser at length gave evident tokens of an alteration in the atmosphere. By 10, I had reason to believe its density considerably increased. By 11, very little labor was necessary, at the apparatus. And at 12 o'clock, with some hesitation, I ventured to unscrew the tourniquet, when, finding no inconvenience from having done so, I finally threw open the gum elastic chamber and unrigged it from around the car. As might have been expected, spasms and violent headache were the immediate consequences of an experiment so precipitate and full of danger. But these and other difficulties attending respiration, as they were by no means so great as to put me in peril of my life, I determined to endure as I best could, in consideration of my leaving them behind me momently in my approach to the denser strata near the moon. This approach, however, was still impetuous in the extreme, and it soon became alarmingly certain that, although I had probably not been deceived in the expectation of an atmosphere dense in proportion to the mass of the satellite, still I had been wrong in supposing this density, even at the surface, at all adequate to the support of the great weight contained in the car of my balloon. Yet this should have been the case, and in an equal degree as at the surface of the earth, the actual gravity of bodies at either planet, supposed in the ratio of the atmospheric condensation. That it was not the case, however, my precipitous downfall gave testimony enough. Why it was not so can only be explained by a reference to those possible geological disturbances to which I have formerly alluded. At all events, I was now close upon the planet, and coming down with the most terrible impetuosity. I lost not a moment, accordingly, in throwing overboard first my ballast, then my water kegs, then my condensing apparatus and gum elastic chamber, and finally every article within the car. But it was all to no purpose. I still fell with horrible rapidity, and was now not more than half a mile from the surface. As a last resource, therefore, having got rid of my coat, hat, and boots, I cut loose from the balloon the car itself, which was of no considerable weight, and thus, clinging with both hands to the network, I had barely time to observe that the whole country, as far as the eye could reach, was thickly interspersed with diminutive habitations, ere I tumbled headlong into the very heart of a fantastical-looking city, and into the middle of a vast crowd of ugly little people, who none of them uttered a single syllable, or gave themselves the least trouble to render me assistance, but stood like a parcel of idiots, grinning in a ludicrous manner, and eyeing me and my balloon askant, with their arms set akimbo. I turned from them in contempt, and gazing upward at the earth so lately left, and left perhaps forever, beheld it like a huge, dull copper shield, about 2 degrees in diameter, fixed immovably in the heavens overhead, and tipped on one of its edges with a crescent border of the most brilliant gold. No traces of land or water could be discovered, and the whole was clouded with variable spots, and belted with tropical and equatorial zones. Drink break? What in the world? Thus it may please your excellencies, after a series of great anxieties, unheard of dangers, and unparalleled escapes, I had at length, on the 19th day of my departure from Rotterdam, arrived in safety at the conclusion of a voyage undoubtedly the most extraordinary and the most momentous ever accomplished, undertaken, or conceived by any denizen of earth. But my adventures yet remain to be related, and indeed upon your excellencies may well imagine that, after a residence of 5 years upon a planet not only deeply interesting in its own peculiar character, but rendered doubly so by its intimate connection, in capacity of satellite, with the world inhabited by man, I may have intelligence for the private ear of the State's College of Astronomers of far more importance than the details, however wonderful, of the mere voyage which so happily concluded. This is, in fact, the case. I have much, very much, which it would give me the greatest pleasure to communicate. I have much to say of the climate of the planet, of its wonderful alternations of heat and cold, of unmitigated and burning sunshine for 1 fortnight, and more than polar frigidity the next, of a constant transfer of moisture by distillation like that in vacuo, from the point beneath the sun to the point the farthest from it, of a variable zone of running water, of the people themselves, of their manners, customs, and political institutions, of their peculiar physical construction, of their ugliness, of their want of ears, those useless appendages in an atmosphere so peculiarly modified, of their consequent ignorance of the use and properties of speech, of their substitute for speech in a singular method of intercommunication, of the incomprehensible connection between each particular individual in the moon with some particular individual on the earth, a connection analogous with and depending upon that of the orbs of the planet and the satellite, and by means of which the lives and destinies of the inhabitants of the one are interwoven with the lives and destinies of the inhabitants of the other. And above all, if it so please your excellencies, above all, of those dark and hideous mysteries which lie in the outer regions of the moon, regions which, owing to the almost miraculous accordance of the satellite's rotation on its own axis with its sidereal revolution about the earth, have never yet been turned, and by God's mercy, shall never be turned to the scrutiny of the telescopes of man. All this and more, much more, would I most willingly detail. But to be brief, I must have my reward. I am pining for a return to my family and to my home, and as the price of any farther communication on my part, in consideration of the light which I have it in my power to throw upon many very important branches of physical and metaphysical science, I must solicit, through the influence of your honorable body, a pardon for the crime of which I have been guilty in the death of the creditors upon my departure from Rotterdam. This, then, is the object of the present paper. Its bearer, an inhabitant of the moon, whom I have prevailed upon and properly instructed to be my messenger to the earth, will await your excellency's pleasure, and return to me with the pardon in question, if it can in any manner be obtained. I have the honor to be, etc., your excellency's very humble servant, Hans Pfaall. I forgot that this was a letter this whole time. Drink break. Upon finishing the perusal of this very extraordinary document, Professor Rub-a-Dub, it is said, dropped his pipe upon the ground in an extremity of his surprise, and Mynheer Superbus von Underduck, having taken off his spectacles, wiped them, and deposited them in his pocket, so far forgot both himself and his dignity, as to turn round 3 times upon his heel in the quintessence of astonishment and admiration. There was no doubt about the matter. The pardon should be obtained. So at least swore, with a round oath, Professor Rub-a-Dub, and so finally thought the illustrious von Underduck, as he took the arm of his brother in science, and without saying a word, began to make the best of his way home to deliberate upon the measures to be adopted. Having reached the door, however, of the burgomaster's dwelling, the professor ventured to suggest that as the messenger had thought proper to disappear, no doubt frightened to death by the savage appearance of the burghers of Rotterdam, the pardon would be of little use, as no one but a man of the moon would undertake a voyage to so vast a distance. To the truth of this observation the burgomaster assented, and the matter was therefore at an end. Not so, however, rumors and speculations. The letter, having been published, gave rise to a variety of gossip and opinion. Some of the overwise even made themselves ridiculous by decrying the whole business as nothing better than a hoax. But hoax with these sort of people is, I believe, a general term for all matters above their comprehension. For my part, I cannot conceive upon what data they have founded such an accusation. Let us see what they say. Imprimis, that certain wags in Rotterdam have certain especial antipathies to certain burgomasters and astronomers. Secondly, that an odd little dwarf and bottle conjurer, both of whose ears, for some misdemeanor, have been cut off close to his head, has been missing for several days from the neighboring city of Bruges. Thirdly, that the newspapers which were stuck all over the little balloon were newspapers of Holland, and therefore could not have been made in the moon. They were dirty papers, very dirty, and Gluck the printer would take his Bible oath to their having been printed in Rotterdam. Fourthly, that Hans Pfaall himself, the drunken villain, and the 3 very idle gentlemen styled his creditors were all seen, no longer than 2 or 3 days ago, in a tippling house in the suburbs, having just returned with money in their pockets from a trip beyond the sea. Lastly, that it is an opinion very generally received, or which ought to be generally received, that the College of Astronomers in the city of Rotterdam, as well as other colleges in all other parts of the world, not to mention colleges and astronomers in general, are, to say the least of the matter, not a whit better, nor greater, nor wiser than they ought to be. Note: strictly speaking, there is but little similarity between the above sketchy trifle and the celebrated moon story of Mr. Locke. But as both have the character of hoaxes, although the one is in a tone of banter, the other of downright earnest, and as both hoaxes are on the same subject, the moon, moreover, as both attempt to give plausibility by scientific detail, the author of Hans Pfaall thinks it necessary to say in self-defense that his own Jeu d'Esprit was published in the Southern Literary Messenger about 3 weeks before the commencement of Mr. L's in the New York Sun. Fancying a likeness which perhaps does not exist, some of the New York papers copied Hans Pfaall and collated it with the moon hoax by way of detecting the writer of the one in the writer of the other. As many more persons were actually gulled by the moon hoax than would be willing to acknowledge the fact, it may here afford some little amusement to show why no one should have been deceived, to point out these particulars of the story, which should have been sufficient to establish its real character. Indeed, however rich the imagination displayed in this ingenious fiction, it wanted much of the force which might have been given it by a more scrupulous attention to facts and to general analogy. That the public were misled, even for an instant, merely proves the gross ignorance which is so generally prevalent upon subjects of an astronomical nature. The moon's distance from the earth is, in round numbers, 240,000 miles. If we desire to ascertain how near, apparently, a lens would bring the satellite or any distant object, we, of course, have but to divide the distance by the magnifying, or more strictly, by the space-penetrating power of the glass. Mr. L makes his lens have a power of 42,000 times. By this divide 240,000, the moon's real distance, and we have 5 miles and 5/7 as the apparent distance. No animal at all could be seen so far, much less the minute points particularized in the story. Mr. L speaks about Sir John Herschel's perceiving flowers, the papaver, etc., and even detecting the color and the shape of the eyes of small birds. Shortly before 2, he has himself observed that the lens would not render perceptible objects of less than 18 inches in diameter, but even this, as I have said, is giving the glass by far too great power. It may be observed in passing that this prodigious glass is said to have been molded at the glass house of Messrs. Hartley and Grant in Dumbarton, but Messrs. H. and G.'s establishment has ceased operations for many years previous to the publication of the hoax. On page 13, pamphlet edition, speaking of a hairy veil over the eyes of a species of bison, the author says, "It immediately occurred to the acute mind of Dr. Herschel that this was a providential contrivance to protect the eyes of the animal from the great extremes of light and darkness to which all the inhabitants of our side of the moon are periodically subjected. But this cannot be thought a very acute observation of the doctor's. The inhabitants of our side of the moon have, evidently, no darkness at all, so there can be nothing of the extremes mentioned. In the absence of the sun, they have a light from the earth equal to that of 13 full unclouded moons. The topography throughout, even when professing to accord with Blunt's lunar chart, is entirely at variance with that or any other lunar chart, and even grossly at variance with itself. The points of the compass, too, are in inextricable confusion, the writer appearing to be ignorant that, on a lunar map, these are not in accordance with terrestrial points, to the east being to the left, etc. Deceived perhaps by the vague titles, Mare Nubium, Mare Tranquillitatis, Mare Fecunditas, whatever, etc., given to the dark spots by former astronomers, Mr. L has entered into details regarding oceans and other large bodies of water in the moon, whereas there is no astronomical point more positively ascertained than that no such bodies exist there. In examining the boundary between light and darkness in the crescent or gibbous moon, where this boundary crosses any of the dark places, the line of division is found to be rough and jagged. But were these dark places liquid, it would evidently be seen. The description of the wings of the man-bat on page 21 is but a literal copy of Peter Wilkins' account of the wings of his flying islanders. This simple fact should have induced suspicion, at least it might be thought. On page 23, we have the following. What a prodigious influence must our 13 times larger globe have exercised upon the satellite when an embryo in the womb of time, the passive subject of chemical affinity. This is very fine, but it should be observed that no astronomer would have made such remark, especially to any journal of science. for the Earth in the sense intended is not only 13 but 49 times larger than the moon. A similar objection applies to the whole of the concluding pages, where, by way of introduction to some discoveries in Saturn, the philosophical correspondent enters into a minute schoolboy account of that planet. This to the Edinburgh Journal of Science. But there is one point in particular which should have betrayed the fiction. Let us imagine the power actually possessed of seeing animals upon the moon's surface. What would first arrest the attention of an observer from the Earth? Certainly neither their shape, size, nor any other such peculiarity, so soon as their remarkable situation. They would appear to be walking with heels up and head down, in the manner of flies on a ceiling. The real observer would have uttered an instant ejaculation of surprise, however prepared by previous knowledge, at the singularity of their position. The fictitious observer has not even mentioned the subject, but speaks of seeing the entire bodies of such creatures, when it is demonstrable that he could have only seen the diameter of their heads. It might as well be remarked in conclusion that the size and particularly the powers of the man-bats, for example, their ability to fly in so rare an atmosphere, if indeed the moon have any, and with most of the other fancies in regard to animal... What? Okay, hang on. Okay, basically, this is just a note on the text that has been added in later. It's not part of the story, but basically it's saying, like, hey, just so you know, this is fake. This is not real. Like, yeah, like, notwithstanding the blunders italicized, the book is not without some claim to attention as affording a naive specimen of the current astronomical notions of the time. One of these assumed that the gravitating power extended but a short distance from the Earth's surface, and accordingly we find our Voyager carried insensibly around the globe, etc. Blah, 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 blah. There have been other voyages to the moon, but none of higher merit than the one just mentioned. That of Bergerac is utterly meaningless. In the third volume of the American Quarterly Review will be found quite an elaborate criticism upon a certain journey to the kind in question, a criticism in which it is difficult to say whether the critic most exposes the stupidity of the book or his own absurd ignorance of astronomy. I forget the title of the work, but the means of the voyage are more deplorably ill-conceived than are even the ganzas of our friend Senor Gonzalez. Blah, 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 blah. In these various brochures, the aim is always satirical, the theme being a description of Lunarian customs as compared with ours. In none is there any effort at plausibility in the details of the voyage itself. The writers seem in each instance to be utterly uninformed in respect to astronomy. In Hans Pfaall, the design is original inasmuch as regards an attempt at verisimilitude in the application of scientific principles so far as the whimsical nature of the subject would permit, to the actual passage between the Earth and the moon. So yes, at the end of the book, there's this massive long, like, author's note basically saying, like, hey, I put out this story at the same time as, like, other people putting out this story, and, like, people got confused and thought that this was real. This is not real. This is fake. This is a work of fiction. You cannot go to the moon in a hot air balloon. Please don't try it. That would be dumb. Oh my goodness. But, my friends, we have finished the 40 some odd pages of The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall by Edgar Allan Poe. I forgot entirely that it was supposed to be a letter that he had written. I do love that it kind of came for full circle, that it was like, even in the story itself, that there were people going, oh, hey, like, this is a hoax, right? Like, a person who had suffered bodily injury has gone missing from this nearby town, so that was the strange little man. And, like, the balloon was covered in newspapers, so, like, that can't have come from the moon. Like, come on, guys, this is fake. They're just trying to get money and sell us this, like, fantastical story. That's so funny. But since we have finished our story, that means we can go back to working on my storybook Halloween WIP, and we can start telling a story there. I'll have to see what the next motif is, and we can go there. But this is where I'm going to wrap up for the day. I finished 2 heads in this video, and I'll see you the next time for the next story. Thank you so much for watching. Be easy with your hearts.